This is the DRF Players Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the April 6th edition of the DRF Players Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale, joined by, in the DRF offices, Mike Hogan, a.k.a. at DRF Formulator, and live from Planet Texas at UT Big Hair himself, Jonathon Kinchen. How are you guys doing today?
Doing good.
So far, so good.
Nothing major to report. Well, we've got a busy show today, mostly looking back at this past weekend of racing. We're running a minute short here today. I had sort of a crazy morning, just a little window into my ridiculous life. Was up at about 6, not only writing my article for today for DRF.com covering the tournament scene, but also reviewing tape for this podcast. Then I took an hour out for Tots Yoga down at the local yoga studio, and Shavasana ran a little long, so I'm a little bit under the gun getting back here, but Perrin and I made it just in time for the podcast, and I'm excited we did. Your guys' mornings similarly busy and productive, I hope?
As always. A couple dogs, getting a kid ready to school, all that stuff, you know. But I'm here and I'm excited.
I'm sure you were studying form all morning, right, Jonathon? With Keeneland coming up this
No, I haven't. I'm still wrapping up trips. I'm a little bit behind for trips at Santa Anita, so I'm trying to get caught up on that before I dive into this weekend's action. I'll be heading to Hawthorne for their tournament, which allows you to play every race at every track. So I'll probably have quite a bit of races to look at. So I'm trying to get some of this other work out of the way so that I can focus.
We're going to do a little tournament talk section of the show today after we deal with our main story. Perhaps we'll delve a little bit deeper into that Hawthorne contest. It's a good opportunity for players in the Midwest, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But first, about that main event. It was a heavyweight showdown. It was the first time that I can remember where the two horses at the top of most people's Kentucky Derby list were facing off before the first Saturday in May down in the Florida Derby. It was Nyquist and Mohaymen, and for a second it looked like it was going to be a real horse race. Here's what it sounded like.
Around the far turn, and here's the battle. It is Nyquist in front, and Mohaymen has moved up into second on the outside, and the two of them will come toward the top of the stretch together. 3/4 in 1, 11 and 1, and they're into the stretch, and it's Nyquist and Mohaymen in their bi-coastal battle at the top of the stretch. On the inside is Mahesto in third. Nyquist has moved away. Mohaymen has no answer today. On the inside is Mahesto, and then comes Fellowship. Nyquist drifting out to the center of the track, but he's far in front, and Nyquist is still unbeaten. He has won the Florida Derby. Mahesto was second, Fellowship was third, Mohaymen settles for fourth, and Sawyer's Mickey was fifth, and a final time of 1 minute 49.11 seconds.
Good stuff there from my friend Larry Colmus, bringing home all the action in what for a second looked like it was going to be the stretch duel that we were all anticipating, and then it wasn't. So this race raises, for me as a handicapper, as many questions as it answered. I think we're going to spend a good portion of the show talking about this race here today. Mike, well, let's start with you. What were your overall impressions of the Florida Derby?
Well, you know, you've got a 2-year-old champion who's now 7 for 7. He's going to go into the Kentucky Derby unbeaten. He's going to go in as likely your clear favorite. I guess the question is what kind of odds he's going to be in the Derby. There are still, despite that performance, despite his record, despite everything else, winning on different coasts, winning at different tracks, winning in the slop, winning on dry tracks. There are still a number of people out there that are questioning whether he's good enough to win the Kentucky Derby. That may help your price on the first Saturday in May, but if by my thinking, he's the leader in the clubhouse right now. He's certainly the horse to beat. And as I said in the last podcast, I doubted him for a while, but I'm done doubting him. If I'm playing the Kentucky Derby, at least if I'm playing it in multi-race wagers, he's a clear A for me. That doesn't mean he's the only one, but I think he's probably the most likely winner at this point.
Jonathon, you were a big fan of Nyquist going into this race. Apparently, you gave half the partygoers in Las Vegas the horse the night before, and you made a lot of people happy. Coming out of the race, are you as excited about Nyquist's chances on the first Saturday in May as our colleague Mike Hogan is?
No, I mean, what you said is true. I mean, I was, and I'll tell a quick story about that. But, you know, I think what I've tried to teach myself, and I've actually been forced to teach myself, is that if you love a horse on day one, it doesn't mean you have to love him on day 21. And I loved Nyquist in that race against Mohaymen, and I'm going to reserve judgment to decide if I love him on Derby Day. But, you know, there's a lot more to figure out. I was trying to look up who the exact favorite was supposed to be that year, but let's all remember that up until the Arkansas Derby a few years back, no one knew that Bodemeister was going to go off favored, because if a horse runs in one of those races and freaks and runs a 106 buyer and wins by 7, that could be our new favorite. So even though Nyquist is undefeated, it happens. It definitely can, especially with bad workout talk and all that good stuff.
I agree with what Mike said. I agree with what Mike said about Nyquist being the leader in the clubhouse. I think that's an apt metaphor. My gut tells me he's not going to be the Derby favorite. My gut tells me, based on the action that we still have to come in the next few weeks, coupled with what came back as a low buyer speed figure, and we'll talk about that much more at length here in a minute, that you could see a big performance from, say, a Cupid that would vault him to the top of the market. Certainly Nyquist will be among the market leaders. I think I'd be surprised if you were to see a price over, say, 4-1 on Nyquist. But I'm not so sure about the clear favoritism. Where do you stand between Mike's perspective and my perspective in that debate, Jonathan?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think if you look back at the horses that have been undefeated going into the Derby of recent years, that this one just doesn't seem to have the same hype behind him. Feels like he continues to have to prove people wrong. The Breeders' Cup Juvenile, he had to prove people wrong. In his comeback race, he had to prove people wrong. This weekend, he had to prove people wrong, and I would imagine the same will be true come the first Saturday in May. For whatever reason, I don't know if it's the pedigree. I don't know what it is, but for whatever reason, people just think this horse doesn't want to go 1.25 miles. The late lead change, the drift in the last race late in the Florida Derby, I'm sure won't help that. The low buyer figure, the 5 weeks off. There's going to be a bunch of things that I think people are going to talk about to find some type of a reason to try to play against the horse.
You just established a bunch of good talking points for us in this segment, Jonathan, and I'll throw the question to Mike first. What did you make of the antics late in the stretch? Certainly not something on paper that you want to see from your Derby favorite, but what was your take, Mike, on the way he came home? Mike.
First, let's mention the on the far turn. The fantastic race riding by Mario Gutierrez by floating Mohaymen out wide, and then turning for home and kind of cutting the corner after that float wide. I think that's what put Mohaymen away. I think he realized he still had enough horse left that he really only had to beat Mohaymen. He wasn't worried about any of the others coming up the rail. It was a great move to win that race. And then once Larry Colmus mentions drifting in the stretch. I'm not so sure that's what it was. I looked a few times, and the sense that I got is at least to my eyes, it looked like Nyquist was reacting to Mario looking once over his shoulder and then again over his shoulder the other way. I took it as a horse that's trained pretty well, took a cue from his rider by leaning one way and said, oh, okay, I'm supposed to go the other way, and then corrected. He did switch back to his left lead late. I'm not so worried about that necessarily. It was the first time going 2 turns in a while. It was the first time going 9 furlongs. Presumably he's come out of the race well, and if he's training well and there's no signs of any other physical ailments, I'm not too worried about what we saw down the stretch.
Jonathan, you stirred up a bit of interesting conversation on Twitter with your take on Nyquist's stretch run. Why don't you tell our listeners what your read on it was and tell me how, if any, your opinion has changed based on some of the feedback you got for that tweet.
Well, I mean, I just think that, I'm first to react when I see late lead changes as a negative. And when I saw that, just like I think we talked about it last week on the podcast down at Fairgrounds, how horses tend to switch leads late in that long stretch. It just felt like to me it was boredom, like, not that, and Andy certainly made a funny joke about how do you know if a horse is bored, but it just didn't feel as if he was doing it because he was tired. He was doing it because his job was done. There was nothing left to do, and so he just relaxed a little bit, and that's just where he ended up in his relaxation zone. It just felt like he was bored, and if someone was running at him, I think he would have stayed engaged and probably been a little bit more focused down the lane.
I think, if there's one thing a thoroughbred knows, it's boredom, since they get to hang out in a stall 23 hours a day. But I do take your point. Some horse, it gets back to what, the concept, which isn't as accepted as it once was, but of equine class, the idea that these horses know how much of an effort they have to put through, and they know when they've done enough. When they're real competitors, and I wouldn't discount that that's the case with Nyquist. I just didn't see, nor have I ever really gotten the impression that he wanted to go that long, which is more where my concerns about the distance come from. There's still a couple other things I want to point out about Nyquist, and then we still got to talk about Mohaymen. This is going to become the Florida Derby edition of the DRF Players Pod, but I think it's interesting and important enough race that we should do that. But Mike, before I pivot a little bit in this conversation, you seemed like you had another point you wanted to make about what Jonathon just said.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to me, that late lead change back to the wrong lead late, it seemed a little bit like it was an add-on to some of the things I was saying. He got a little bored. He kind of was trying to take a cue from his rider. He wasn't really sure what to do, and then he just switched back to the other lead. I'm not so worried about it. I know our buddy Matt Bernier saw it as a huge negative afterwards. And the last point I'll make about whether or not he wants to get the distance, I didn't see any problem with the way he ran in the stretch. And if you look at the incremental splits, he ran the final 3/8 faster than any other horse in the field, even the ones that were trying to make up ground late. Look, maybe he does lose on the first Saturday in May, but I haven't seen it, and I don't think it's necessarily going to be because he doesn't want to go 10 furlongs. I haven't really seen another horse in this list of contenders so far that has shown me that they want to go that far, and is it really any more brilliant than what I've seen from Nyquist?
Now, a lot of people are going to crab Nyquist based on this low buyer figure, and I actually did a lot of digging into this number. And while obviously I incredibly respect the buyer team's work and I rely on it, and I think they're great, and I'm not trying to knock anybody in saying this, but it's just my own personal opinion, looking through the races on the card, that figure comes back a little low. And just taking a look at some other figure makers who I respect, the buyer is definitely sort of the lowest of the numbers that I respect that have come back out of the race. So that doesn't really concern me that much. I think, all things considered, this figure could have very easily come back closer to the low triple-digit figure that folks expected. That being said, I'm still not wild about the performance because of something we haven't talked about at all, and that was the track bias on the day, that I think was a day where inside paths were greatly preferred, especially before the second-to-last dirt race when they harrowed the track, and I think the track changed. The surface, to me, slowed down a bit at that point of harrowing, which is part of the reason why I believe the buyer came back low, but I think it also made that inside even more exaggerated as the place you want to be. So with that in mind, I think that everything was in place for Nyquist to run a really big top, and the fact that he only kind of, even if giving him extra credit for the figure, plateaued on a track and in a situation that favored him, I mean, hey, I guess you could say he did have to contend with those 100-to-1 shots early as part of the pace. In my own sort of reckoning of the race, I was almost treating it like he was a lone front runner. Am I being too harsh with that? I mean, even though those other horses out on the lead with him were 100-to-1, does he deserve credit for dealing with that pace scenario the way that he did? What do you think, Mike?
Well, I don't know if he necessarily deserves credit for dealing with the pace scenario, but he did put away a couple ridiculous long shots and then held off his main competition late. So, that's the kind of thing you want to see, especially in the first two-turn start of the year for him, with just the one lone sprint since the Breeders' Cup. I don't worry about the number coming back a little comparatively low. And if you compare it to the other top buyers for two-turn, sort of 3-year-olds in two-turn races, it's not. Look, you've got Dancing Candy and Destin with equal 101 or 100s, followed by Donegal Moon at Parks. So it's not like you've got all of these other horses that are regularly running a lot faster. He's shown he can run that fast with the 101 in the San Vicente. I kind of like that he's not going into the race off of a top effort. I think there could be more, another forward move coming, and if so, that's why I like him a little bit, or at least am less skeptical than what I've heard some people say about him. But
I'm a little, because I hear what you're saying. It makes sense that you'd leave something in the tank, obviously. But they needed to win that race a lot more than Mohaymen did because of that $1 million bonus for having been in that particular sale. So that also makes me wonder how much better we can really expect. I don't know, Jonathan. Where do you stand on the question of how much Nyquist has left in the tank?
Well, I wouldn't doubt that there's any possibility that the horse still has a lot left in the tank. I obviously wanted to win the race. Obviously, Doug O'Neill and Paul Redham, their focus is going to be the Kentucky Derby. But if their focus was solely the Kentucky Derby, they would have stayed at home and they would have ran at Santa Anita. And so the idea that they got on an airplane tells me that they were ready to run. It wasn't a prep. It wasn't this is the race before the race thing that they were thinking. So, I'm sure he was ready to rock and roll. And one of the things that I think Doug, people underestimate Doug for is his ability to get horses to run long. And I think that I'll Have Another was a prime example of that. I think that the same conversations were being had about I'll Have Another's ability to get the distance. And just by the nature of the way that Doug O'Neill trains, and I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with it, but I've heard a lot of people talk about it, essentially he just gallops horses miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. He just gallops them and gallops them and gallops them. And sometimes when you look at Doug O'Neill's horses, their past performances, you'll see breaks in the workout pattern. It's because they're not getting official times because they're just galloping every day, and they're not even getting an official time. And so if anyone can stretch a horse out, surprisingly enough, I think Doug O'Neill is one that can definitely do it.
All right, we got to talk more about Mohaymen. If I'm right about this bias, there's another excuse for Mohaymen. He, unlike Nyquist, not worried as much about the $1 million bonus. I buy the idea that he might have come into the race a little bit short, or not needing to win as much as Nyquist did. And then you have him running in what I believe was the wrong part of the track, in what I also thought was kind of by design, according to McLaughlin, a bit of a wide passive ride, in that he really just didn't want him to get stuck, didn't really want him to get dirt kicked in his face, etc. He ran considerably farther than the winner did. So there's all these reasons why I could see a Mohaymen fan making excuses for Mohaymen based on all that stuff. Still, as a objective handicapper, I'm finding myself having trouble buying it, simply because I feel like this is a case where, despite the excuses, I just wanted to see him do a little bit more running. And I feel like he just didn't impress me in that regard in the stretch. Jonathan, am I being too harsh?
Oh, well, you're asking the wrong. I'm just not really a fan. He's just one of those horses. He seems to kind of always had things his way. I'm not buying it. I think that he's going to be an attractive price after this compared to what he was. But I still think he's going to get a lot of attention. I think he had a lot of fans going into the race. I think a lot of people are going to give him another shot. A lot of people are going to kind of go with what you said, with the bias and him being outside. And like I said, the price should be a little bit more enticing. But I'm just not impressed. I wasn't impressed going into the race, and I don't think I'm going to be looking to play him going into the first Saturday in May.
Mike, can you dispense a little Mohaymen love, or are we 3 for 3 on this topic?
I think we're probably close to 3 for 3. You know, if he's the horse that you liked in the Kentucky Derby, or prior to the Florida Derby, if he's the one that you were looking forward to playing in the Kentucky Derby, you've got some head scratching going on, because he's that effort left many more questions than answers. I don't like my Derby play to be coming in off of a poor effort, especially one as poor as that. He finished 4th against a field that he clearly, I mean, he was favored over Nyquist, and a lot of people thought that not only was he going to be in the exacta, but he was going to be better than Nyquist. He not only had no answer for Nyquist, he just had nothing at all late. He beat some now seemingly questionable fields. I mean, arguably the best horse he beat in Florida was Fellowship, because nobody else from any of those fields, we'll see what Zulu does on Saturday, but nobody else has really come back to do anything from any of those races. I think we might just have a horse that may have had some favorable setups in South Florida. It is going to be overbet in the Kentucky Derby based on those, and I would want at least 30 or 40 to 1 to play him in the Derby, and I don't think you're going to get that.
Jonathan, anybody else to take out of the Florida Derby, or should we move it along to some tournament talk?
Yeah, I think we should move it along. I think anybody that made any runs late, they were just running for a check. You know, I don't think Fellowship was trying to win the race. I don't think a lot of them were trying to win the race. I think they were just trying to get a check. So nothing for me.
I think it's good to take this moment, because we have a lot of tournament stuff to talk about. We may end up just talking tournaments until we turn on the Periscope and solicit a couple of questions from our audience. Actually, you know what? I'll send a tweet while we're doing this just to let people know that we'll be Periscoping, say, I don't know, 20 minutes from now, like 11:45. And that's something that regular podcast listeners to the show can take a look for in future weeks, is us doing a little piece of the podcast. It'll vary from week to week, but on Periscope. Jonathan, I want to start with you. You had a couple, there's a bunch of headlines, but I've already written about a lot of stuff and gave a pretty good breakdown of stuff on the Big Show this week. You had a couple of really interesting little tidbits from the tournament world. I want to start with those before we sort of backtrack and talk about the Horseplayer World Series, and who I believe is our new leader on the NHC Tour.
Yeah, no, I think that, yeah, well, first thing is that I was looking at the BC Qualify scores and saw some pretty good stuff. I mean, I think that, and one of the things that kind of caught my attention is places 1 through 23. If they were playing on DRF Qualify for a seat to the Preakness tournament at Santa Anita, which I think is a $4,500 buy-in tournament or $4,000 buy-in tournament, either way, it's up there, they would have won that seat. And so it's one of those situations, man, when I play on DRF Qualify or BC Qualify or NHC Qualify, it's very rare that I just play in one. It's just like a day at the races. You know, if I always tell people, you know, I joke about crushing their soul. When you're right, you have to make them pay for it. And when you have a good day, you have to take and rake in all the money that you possibly can, because our bad days are going to be more than our good ones. And so, you know, the guys that were on BC Qualify 1 through 23 all would be on orbits or whatever you use to set a ticket to go out to California and, for the Preakness tournament. And so that kind of caught my attention. Another thing, and this is obviously me pointing out a friend of mine's awesome decision, but if you guys get a chance, look at the leaderboard on DRF Qualify for Sunday. Lawrence Calden, who's obviously a huge tournament player. I'm sorry, it was actually a different Lawrence. A different Lawrence K. But Daniel Kovaleski had an opportunity to chase a horse in the last race to try to win that seat, and instead he picked the favorite that he had singled on all of his pick fours, because that horse was going to guarantee him $900 in site credit. And I thought that was just amazing. You know, as much as we hear about the tournament world, about people stabbing and picking long shots just because they're trying to get to a different position. And Dan was smart enough in this situation to take a short price horse, Beach Patrol in the last at Santa Anita, and that locked him into that $900 worth of site credit. And making decisions like that, in my opinion, will turn that $900 of site credit into something good for Dan. And so I wanted to commend him for that, because I thought that was pretty cool.
It is very cool. I mean, I think there's an old school gambling mentality. Hey, you've got a shot at 5,000. No favorite has to win. You're supposed to go for the win there. But we always advocate the Paul Sherman maxim on this show of play who you like. And if you truly believe there's this even money shot who's more like a 2 to 5 shot in your mind, why play against yourself? I can act from a gambling theory point of view, I can argue it either way. But I love the idea of seeing a tournament player like Danny Kaye, who's a strategic thinker, putting that to use. Mike, as somebody who doesn't play in tournaments or doesn't follow tournaments as much as either of us, which logic there seems correct to you? Are you supposed to go for the win when you're up for 5K, or do you play who you like and be happy with your 900?
Well, I'm not really a hedger. What I would do is I would double down on my opinions, and if that is able to get me more, I don't like hedging. I don't like stabbing. So if my strong opinion is able to get me something, as opposed to stabbing and feeling like most likely I'm going to get nothing, I'm going to do what Dan did.
Yeah, I was in that situation once on a contest site that shall not be named because I like my job working at Daily Racing Form. But it was a situation where I was in something like 5th place going into the last race. Top prize was 6,000, say. Second was maybe 1,500, maybe even was a little bit more. And I could have played a cap horse to try to win. And I think I would have done it had I been in second, interestingly. But because there was a limited number of cap horses and 3 people in front of me who also needed to play cap horses, I said, the heck with this. I'm going to play the Baffert even money shot and steal second and make a few extra bucks. So that's the thing about tournaments and why I love them and why I don't like tournaments where all your picks go in beforehand. You lose this extra level of strategy, the end game, where it becomes a bit like a chess match. And it's fun to point out examples along those lines. Jonathan, have you ever been in a situation like that? I could see you being more of a go for the win at all costs guy in your actual play.
Yeah, no, lots of times. I was in a tournament site. I was playing in a tournament, and this is one of the first times Paul Sherman and Bill Sherman emailed me asking me what the heck I was doing. I took a favorite. I took the same favorite on. I was in the top 10 on with 2 entries, and I took the same favorite on both because I thought the horse couldn't lose. The horse obviously lost, and I didn't do well. But they, I'll take, like from an old football idea, I just take what the defense gives me, and if I don't, there's no reason to try to bang your head against a wall. If I think a horse is going to win, I'm going to play the horse I think is going to win. Now, obviously, there's a time and a place for that, right? I mean, if there's no prize for 9th place, then don't take the favorite in 9th place. You need to take the horse that can get you into the prize. But in a situation where there's, that's either prize A or prize B, and prize A is not very likely, let's just go ahead and guarantee ourselves prize B.
If you can play who you like. Let's talk a little bit about the news. Jonathan, you were not going to go to the Horseplayer World Series. I told the saga of you on the Friday show nearly getting arrested in the Phoenix airport. Folks can go back and listen to that on the Friday show. You ended up going out to Vegas. How was your experience out there, and what sort of news do you have from the Horseplayer World Series?
Oh, it's always a fun event. It's stressful. I can promise you that. It's 3 days. 15 races apiece, 7 racetracks. There's a lot of races to look at. That's always a challenge, but it's a lot of fun. It's 2 really big rooms, very similar to the NHC. I got to hang out with the Matisse family, James Henry, Sean Turner, Tom Lute. So that was always fun. I'm hanging out with those guys and just kind of watching. I think the Matisse family is like, I just hope that one day my family's like, I just love it, like my son, and it's just great. There's grandkids running around talking about horses. It's the coolest thing in the world. So that was always fun. We didn't do that great. I mean, I think Duke and Sean both finished in the top 60 in cash. But it's a tough event, man. It's very similar to the NHC in terms of you can't just have one good day. You got to have 3 good days, but it's definitely one that I would encourage people to check out. It's very similar feel to the NHC, but you don't have to qualify in. You can buy in. So definitely worth checking out.
There was a lot of drama at the end of the tournament. Now, when I originally reported it, I didn't get it 100% right. I've since gotten the full story that I'll relay to you guys now. I think you'll be hearing this for the first time. Going into there were basically 2 races left, and Dan Kaplan was leading. His friend John Connolly was second and third. Those guys hang out together in Front Runner at the Santa Anita contest. They hang out at Del Mar. They've known each other for 5 or 6 years, and they're like tournament buddies, like so many of these relationships that we see develop on the contest scene. So heading into that second to last race, Connolly played the horse that ran second. That should have given him enough points where he was in first and third with Kaplan in second going into the last race. By happenstance, in the last race, they played the same horse. Therefore, Connolly, based on those place points he'd gotten, should have been the winner. Except when the final leaderboard comes up, Kaplan's name's in the front. So there's a long audit, and they're trying to figure out what happened. Long story short, Connolly did play that horse in the second to last race, but he played it on the wrong ticket. This mispunch cost him $200,000. His loss, of course, Kaplan's gain. Kaplan ends up winning over $300,000 at the Horseplayer World Series. He's an interesting character. He plays at a lot of those Santa Anita contests. He'll be back in May. All he does these days is play horses. I'm going to have a little profile of him that's going to be in the Saturday copy of the Daily Racing Form. It'll be up online tomorrow. Jonathon, let me just ask you as a contest player, can you imagine the feeling in your stomach making a $200,000 mispunch? Do you have any story anywhere, even in the ballpark of that?
No. And I'm not trying to be that has never happened to me, but it never has happened to me. I typically will pull up an Excel sheet and kind of keep track of where I'm at and what I'm doing. And that usually can keep me from avoiding that. I also double check my tickets and, whatever. But I can understand how it happened because it gets very, very confusing in there. I'm just honest with myself that I'm probably going to have an adult beverage by the end of the tournament, and I'm going to have to have some better organization in order so I can avoid a mistake like that.
I think I would bring my own personal actuary to manage my cards, playing multiple tickets in an event like that, where on some of the days you have 8 tracks, and it's a lot of plays to coordinate, and that definitely demonstrates some of the perils of playing multi-tickets. Don't have to feel too bad for Mr. Connolly. He still walks with over $100,000 for his second and third money. By all accounts, a great guy, and I was very happy to hear that he wasn't. Nobody would have really blamed him if he was a little sour after it, but apparently there was no friction at all between Kaplan and Connolly. Connolly just accepted it as one of those things that happened, and he'll be ready to get them the next time. You mentioned the Matisse family. The other family making news in the contest world these days is the Scotes family. Son Chris Scotes already double qualified for the NHC. His father is Robert Scotes. They ran 1-2 on DRF bets this weekend. That's Scotes' second DRF bets victory of 2016. He also ran 6th on NHC Qualify on the same day. He picks up about 4,700 tour points, and I assume he'll be on or near the lead when Michelle Ravencraft posts those new NHC Tour standings at ntra.com a little bit later this week. Have you had any dealings with Chris Scotes, Jonathon?
No, I haven't had a chance to meet him. I don't think.
He's got a little bit of a handicap in his tour chase in that he's got activity-aged kids whom he spends most of the summer shepherding around and going to events and things. So the damage he's going to do is going to be more limited to this time of year and also to the fall. I predict that the key tournament for him vis-a-vis the tour is going to be those Treasure Island tournaments happening over Derby weekend. They're a great deal. They're going to be very popular again. 100% payback at Treasure Island, the host hotel of the National Handicapping Championship, a chance to get some serious points. Scotes will be playing in those. I think if he does well there, he might just try to find a way to continue to accrue points across the spring and summer and then be able to devote himself in the fall. Chris Scotes is definitely one of the early favorites for me on the NHC Tour this year. You have your eye on anybody in particular to make a tour run, other than yourself?
No, I mean, I'm trying to think of anyone else that I've seen. I think Moomy has got a couple of scores already. I think he's always dangerous when you give him a few scores, because he'll play in everything that they provide. And, I think that the biggest thing to look for is, who's going to win the big live events. I think that the Monmouth event coming up, that I think DRF is actually starting qualifiers for starting this weekend. Monmouth at the beginning of June, I think, will be pretty interesting. They should get a lot of players for that. It's a live event. Obviously, Saratoga in the summer always gets a lot of people. Winning one of those with a lot of people entered is what the live events with a lot of people entered is what really makes the difference. And so I would be looking, maybe starting the next month or so for who's going to really make a push at it.
I was expecting you to put in a plug for our mutual friend, John Nichols. John was third on NHC Qualify this weekend. Because he's a clocker at Churchill, it does limit his travel schedule. Do you think that limits him too much for him to make a run at the overall win, or do you think, Jonathan, he can maybe find time in his schedule to win one of those big ones and be a name we see there at the end of the year?
Well, no, I think that John's definitely a danger. I think he was a danger last year. All the way until the last month, he was kind of drifting down on the list, but he still hadn't had a live score, and so I had my eye on him, because if he would have gotten one, he could have been one that was very dangerous. The thing about John is that, like you said, his work schedule is tough, because he's clocking when we're betting. For the most part, he's, wherever we're playing in tournaments, he's typically going to be working. And then also, John focuses a lot on his other part of racing, which would be the part that we're all talking about now is betting. And so I think that, his focus is a lot of the times on that, not really running around the country playing in tournaments as much.
You did break some news there. I didn't realize it was official. We are on Sunday, April 10th, running a one-day qualifier for the $150,000 Monmouth Park Pick Your Prize event. It's a $210 entry fee, and up to two $2,500 packages will be awarded out of that. I assume you'll be playing, Jonathan. It's one package for every 14 entries, a very favorable ratio. Will you be double-barreled in there?
I would imagine so. I'll be in Chicago, so I'll probably be running around O'Hare somewhere trying to get on a standby flight, and so it's a real easy time to pop in some picks and see if I can't get lucky.
I love Monmouth Park. Mike, have you ever been down there since you've been back on the East Coast or in your childhood days?
I never have. In fact, I was telling some of the folks in the office here, I've driven through, but I've never actually set foot in the state of New Jersey, if you can believe that. So, isn't that crazy? Yeah, certainly not a point of pride, and definitely something that I have to rectify in the near future.
I recommend it. Brian Skirka, who runs the tournaments down there, does a great job. I plan on going down for that contest, the June 4th contest. I might want to try to get down there again if you want to. I don't know if you can ever make a trip. It's a great trip from Manhattan. You can take a boat down and then Uber from Atlantic Highlands or whatever, or I think there's even buses as the weather gets warmer right to Monmouth Park. It's a really fun place to spend an afternoon. They got a great vibe down there and a terrific culture of tournament play. You see a lot of players: Kenny Jordan, Roger Satina, The Undertaker, Stephen Thompson, Joe Corey. They come from far and wide to attend all those Monmouth contests, and there's something folks should definitely check out, and I'm really excited to be able to step up my relationship in covering those events.
Pete,
I don't.
One more thing.
Oh, you go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, just if you are thinking about the Monmouth tournament, like Pete said, the boat is really fun. The boat picks up like in Wall Street. It takes you right down. It's really kind of cool to roll down on the boat. The other thing you can do is if you have a significant other or whatever, you can stay in the city and you can take the train from like Penn Station, and when they're live racing, it like literally like drops off at the 8th pole. And it's really easy. It's like a 45-minute, 50-minute ride. You can handicap on the train. So it's actually really an easy place to get to.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that boat, there is also a Midtown East stop on that boat too. So you can go from like East and from 34th Street basically on the east side, or from Wall Street, like you said. So it's pretty cool. Now, we don't really have time to do a full recap of the races, but I do just want to very quickly say, listeners to the show on Friday, you got to listen to these Friday shows, man. We had a lot of winners on Friday. We talked about Reporting Star, who won. We talked about Grand Shores, who won. And I think you can make the case that a horse that Chris Larney picked in the Orchid, I guess it was, 9-1 Song of Ice and Fire, might have been just as good as the winner Photo Call based on trips. And certainly, if you'd listened to us, coming up with that exacta was something that you could have done. So I don't know, Jonathan, you maybe should have tuned in to the podcast. You might have done a little bit better in your Saturday Horseplayer World Series entry.
Yeah, I know. My partner wanted Reporting Star, and I talked him out of it because of my love affair with the Desidero. So for the rest of the day, I kept getting if Jonathan will let me pick winners. Yeah,
the Herald partners. You should have listened to the show, man. I was all over Reporting Star. I just thought it was a case of, I just thought the pace sort of set up favorably. I don't know that I want him going forward as opposed to those tough 4-year-olds who I think were both a bit compromised because of the pace and the way that race played out, Force the Pass and Desidero. I think you can make valid claims about either one of those horses going forward. I'll ask you, Mike, of Desidero and Force the Pass, who are you more inclined to bet next time out?
Well, it's a good question. It's hard for me to kind of separate the two because I think that they're two of the best, if not the two best, 3-year-old turfers or 3-year-old male turfers that we saw last year. So I was excited to see them both run. I think Force the Pass, like we said in the webinar, or sorry, in the podcast, that he was ready to run. Goldberg gets them usually ready to run off the bench. Buff Bradley usually gives them a start or two. So they were both coming into the race in seemingly good form and able to run a top effort. My concern with Desidero going forward, I hate to say it because I'm not really a jockey knocker, but he might need somebody other than Edgar Prado. Prado's got 1 win so far on the year. Maybe if he gets a jockey switch to somebody that's a bit of more of a top rider, he becomes the one. But it's hard to rely on Prado at this point.
Yeah, I mean, that might be a bit harsh. I do think, knowing what the pace situation was there, I mean, it certainly was tactically disadvantaged ride. Maybe I'm just being politically correct and you're dead on, Mike. I don't know. But it certainly seems that horse is more happy making his one run as a closer as opposed to moving up on the back stretch, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't want to spend too much time on that, Jonathan, unless you have something earth-shattering to add. I've just thrown us live up on Periscope, and I have a couple questions in the hopper here, and I want to throw it out to people watching via Periscope if they have any questions about this weekend of racing coming up, something that happened last weekend. I say we spend the last 12 or 13 minutes we have on the show today dealing with that. And I'm going to start with a question that we've had in the queue for quite a while, and this one is about handicapping angles. And the question is, and Mike, I'll let you start with it, what do you think is the most overrated handicapping angle?
Well, you helped set up this answer a little earlier when you talked about the track bias on Florida Derby Day. For me, it's track bias, hands down. I'll preface that by saying, not because I don't believe that track biases exist. They absolutely do, and when you recognize them, you can certainly score and cash and help land on live horses. My feeling, though, is they're much, much, much more rare and much more subtle than I hear a lot of people talking about. They're like the zebras in the pack of horses. Most likely, it's that, and I'll use a number of examples. Take Charge Brandy on Breeders' Cup Day. People were screaming track bias. Well, it turned out she was maybe the best horse in that field who had a bit of a tactical advantage on a track. And there's a difference in my feeling between a track bias and a track profile. In a track that profiles more towards speed, which is, say, Southern California surfaces, Santa Anita in particular. And the last thing I'll say about it, and the reason why I'm always so hesitant to lean heavily on track biases, is it will take weeks and sometimes months for that feeling like, oh, I think there may have been a bias on Cigar Mile Day, to truly play out, because you need to see horses run back multiple times in order to figure out whether that long shot that held on was carried by the way the track was playing that day versus is starting to improve and may be actually a better horse than they looked on paper that day. So it's one in my handicapping I look at, but I usually don't lean that heavily on. In fact, I sometimes love to play against the common perception that there was a biased track on a certain day, because it seems like everybody thinks that way and then bets accordingly.
Well, I mean, my friend Jake Jacobs, who's a big believer in track bias and is the proprietor, or one of the proprietors of RacingFlow.com, has a great line that I think is in line a bit with what you're saying, the idea that there are a lot more track bias players than there are track biases. That said, I'll be honest with you, in a discussion of overrated factors of handicapping, I almost don't know how that could come up, simply because if you're not paying attention to it on the days where it does matter, Saturday at Gulfstream being just one of those days, I just don't know how you're ever going to have a positive ROI. I mean, I think there are days when it is by far the dominant factor, and while it may be, I'm not disagreeing that it might be overrated or people call it out too often. I agree with you on that, and I don't agree with what everybody says. It's very subjective and hard to understand. Completely agree with you about that, but I mean, when it matters, it really matters. Jonathan, I want you to chime in on this.
Yeah, I mean, so what Mike said is actually, you're actually both right and both wrong. So Mike said, it is 100% the most overrated thing in racing, because the people that are screaming about it all the time don't have a clue what they're talking about, and they don't really know if they're right or wrong. So like the amount of work that you have to do to understand if there really is a track bias, there's no way that 90% of the people that are saying there's a track bias are doing. So yes, it is the most overrated because there's a lot of people that are using it the wrong way. But I do think that it's also one of the most underrated things, and that if you do it correctly, the amount of information and winners that you will find off of track biases and horses running back off of track biases it's astounding. And you'd be shocked how often tracking it correctly and thoroughly will find winners for you that you would have absolutely never found before.
I'm willing to just give the point to Jonathan and end that debate right there. I think he nailed it.
Fair enough. I guess my point is more after one race or two races, he'll hear people talking about things like bias. And I think it's a word that is best reserved for the most extreme of circumstances. And, I don't see it being used as such.
Absolutely.
Here's one that came in for Jonathan, somebody who watched you on the Tom Quigley broadcast, the simulcast show he does before the races when you were out there at the contest, what was that now, almost 3 weeks ago. And apparently on the simulcast show, you gave out something like 5 winners, according to this person, and yet at the end of the day, both of your cards had 0. How is this possible?
I don't know who that is, but I guarantee I know the person who's ever asking that question. They know that it's I have done unbelievably well on Quigley. Every time I'm on Quigley, I give like 4 or 5 winners, and then every time it's a tournament day, and I do awful. I don't know. I guess I need to get myself together. It's just one of those things where that's kind of the beauty of live money tournaments, is that you can play your opinion. And although I'm picking winners on that show, I'm not picking my opinion isn't running where it needs to run, and my heavy investments aren't running when I need them to run, or there's a third place horse that's messing me up in certain situations. So that's probably what happened in that situation.
Here's one, Mike, I'll let you take first. Keeping in mind that one of the owners of this horse is probably watching this podcast, if not live on Periscope with us, certainly will be listening. Keen Ice was just changed from the barn of Dale Romans to Todd Pletcher. What do you make of that change?
I understand why they're doing it. And the analogy that they used was, when you've got an athlete that's maybe in a little bit of a slump, sometimes a change of the coaches can help wake them up. So I respect them for it, and it certainly has worked in the past. And one of the horses that comes to mind is Finnegan's Wake. Did a similar move to Peter Miller and then ran off a number of good stakes wins. What I'll say about Keen Ice is he's obviously a quality horse, and he at his best is potentially one of the best horses in training, but he's almost a horse that I think that Travers win in retrospect might have been, at least for his future races, a bit of a negative when, this is a horse that's still eligible for an N2X, maybe going forward to the Breeders' Cup Classic and then even moving on to Dubai might not have been the best move for him from a confidence level. Now you've got a horse that's seemingly a little bit off form, that has some conditions left, maybe get a spot where he, just towers over the field, get him back in the winner's circle, get him back into that positive form cycle, trainer move or not. To me, that seems like what he needs and certainly will help the confidence.
Here's an email that came in from Sam, who wants to know how many LPs I have. I'll move aside. I'll give you a quick little overview. If you're watching on Periscope, you can see the various record cabinets that I have around here. I haven't counted in a while, but I think the total is close to 3,000 or so, mostly inherited from my dad. But my dad had started, sort of ironically, selling off a lot of his vinyl, and I have spent the 4 years since his passing probably rebuying a lot of the stuff that he sold, just because I kind of like to have it all. I kind of like to have it all here. So, all right, we got another question that came in. Here's a speed handicapping question. This is from Nick. What do you guys look for when differentiating the speed of the speed from the mere speed in dirt and turf sprints? Jonathan, that's one for you.
Yeah, so one of the things you can do is if you use Formulator is turn on the Moss pace figures. That's one way you can start. It's just a good number that you can look down at. Unfortunately, you won't see that in turf sprints. So, you might have to find a different way to do that. Maybe if you want to watch the replay or look at the fraction, it's different when it comes from different tracks. One of the things I would be careful with in turf sprints is a horse that always gets the lead going 6 or 6.5 or 7 is not necessarily going to get the lead going 5 or 5.5. So make sure you look at that. You differentiate those two distances. And then the other thing about speed of the speed is if you feel like there's a tie between the 1, the 4, and the 11 horse, you could expect that the 1 or the 11 are going to be sent away from there and could inherit being the speed of the speed based on their post position.
Yeah, post position does factor in there in an interesting way. Mike, I know you're a big believer in the Moss pace figures. Anything to add to what Jonathan said?
Yeah, and obviously, as Jonathan noted, Moss pace doesn't exist on the turf races. But a couple other things that I'll do. Sometimes it's jockey, either a jockey switch or certain jockeys tend to be more aggressive from the gate than others. Sometimes we'll look at that, and also works. If you see a really, really fast blowout, 3 furlongs in 34 just prior to the race, sometimes that's a little bit of a tip of the hand as to what the strategy is that day.
Great point about jockeys. That's something Jonathan has talked about on the show before too, just sort of knowing the riders whose inclination it is to go and knowing the riders whose inclination it is to grab. We got a question in about the Bluegrass Stakes, which I'll admit I haven't looked at yet, so I'm going to have to punt on this one. But if either of you boys have looked at it, looking for an opinion on Donegal Moon in the Bluegrass.
Donegal Moon was supposed to be a good horse. I remember, in fact, this is actually a good story considering I'm going to Hawthorne this weekend. I was going to play that pick 5 that I had won, that I won, whatever it was, 20 grand on, that virtually won me the tour with my first outright win of the tournament season last year. And my ticket, my ticket was, the entries were $350 each, so I had $700 to bet into the pick 5, and I needed $705 the way that my ticket came out on Ticketmaker, and Donegal Moon was working huge at Saratoga, and I bet $25 or $25 or $40 or something on him to show so that I could get that $5, and he ran up the track. So I've been following that horse since his debut. I know his race at Parks was impressive, and you know, I know they've always thought a lot about the horse. I mean, he's an interesting horse to win underneath. I mean, to use underneath. I don't see how the horse wins the race, but he's definitely one to consider.
Mike, have you taken a look at the Bluegrass at all?
A little bit. I kind of wonder if that question came in from Elliot Honecker, because of course Donegal Moon is owned by Donegal Racing, the same owners of Keen Ice, and I know Elliot has a share of the 3-year-olds this year, so you know, and absolutely wish him the best of luck. But you know, Mike, I'm kind of with Jonathan on this one. He's a horse that, at his best, has shown some talent, and certainly has liked the Keeneland track and run well in the 2 starts he's run there. I just don't know how much I can trust that last race at Parks. If you believe it, he's the fastest horse in the race. He's got a 99 buyer. It towers over everybody else in the field. But his other races, and you know, I'll draw a line through the Jerome, where you know he basically wasn't able to run. But the other races, you know, he was never really much of a factor against graded stakes company. And you know, if you get a decent price, like Jonathan, he might be one that is seemingly improving and can hit the board. But I don't know if I trust him much on the win end. And I think based on the connections and based on the buyer, he might be overbet.
Hey, and Mike, and not to go to formulator, you know, webinar on everyone, but if you click on the date of the race and you on formulator and you look to see what horses have run buyer speed figures out of that, that's sometimes what I'll do to try to see how I feel about whether a number was too high or not. I don't know what it is. I haven't looked at it, but see if those horses are what they've done subsequently, you know, out of that race to find out if maybe that number was a little bit high or a little bit low.
Well, that's a perfect
you know,
talk about the webinars coming up this week, Mike. We have one tomorrow and one Friday. Why don't you give folks a rundown, and then we'll get out of here.
That's right. Tomorrow, Jonathan and I will be doing the Santa Anita card, specifically focused on the Santa Anita Derby, of course, but I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot of other stuff. That's at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 a.m. Pacific Time. Should be a ton of fun. And then on Friday, Pete, you and I pleasure of handicapping the pick 4, the cross-country pick 4. I don't know exactly what they're calling it, the Keeneland Bluegrass Big Apple pick 4, between Keeneland and Aqueduct. It's the Bayshore, the Madison, the Bluegrass, and the Wood Memorial with Stephen Christ. So that'll be an exciting one. That's 11 a.m. on Friday.
Excellent. All right, folks, there you have it. That's it for this edition of the DRF Players Podcast. I'm Peter Thomas Fornatale. Thank you so much to Mike Hogan. Thank you so much to Jonathon Kinchen. Thanks to all of you out there joining us by Periscope and, of course, through whatever method you get your podcasts. We will be back on Friday with a look ahead to the weekend's races. May you win all your photos.